Now, at least 40 community radio stations are going to be off the airways due to licensing issues. The Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, otherwise known as ICASA, says it's unfortunate that they've had to pull the plug on the broadcasters, but they say that the law is the law. Some of the affected stations include UCT FM and Eastern Cape-based Nzo FM, and they are petitioning their listeners to campaign against their imminent closure. We're joined now in studio by Azola Daile, a researcher at Media Monitoring Africa, who's had his ear on the ground on this story. Azola, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. So, I mean, I used to work in community radio, and licensing issues are an old issue. It's always been this huge challenge, that and royalties. But it doesn't seem that we found a workable solution for community stations.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. In fact, it's not a bit unfortunate. It's very unfortunate because a lot of people, particularly people who are in the peripheries, you know, your rural communities, your peri-rural communities, your townships, rely a lot on community radio stations. So when you know, ICASA comes and says it wants to close over 40, I mean, 15 already been closed already. It's unfortunate, but also it speaks to the issue of, I guess, capacity within these institutions, these community radio stations or community media, where, for instance, one person could be doing multiple jobs, you know, besides being a presenter, they also have to do admin. There are also technicalities around this renewal of licenses. So perhaps for me, what ICASA, what the Department of Communications should have done is have, you know, sort of like capacitation workshops, capacity building for people within these institutions to be able to timelessly submit whatever that they need to submit so that there's a continuation of these particular institutions, because it's not in the public interest to just be punitive and say that we are closing these community radio stations. Of course, we understand that there is a problem. I mean, mainstream media is always given a chance, you know, to come back after making a few mistakes. So it's really unfortunate on my part. I mean, also it's an attack on media freedom. It's taking people's rights away from, I mean, freedom of expression, for instance, freedom to access information, Section 32 of the Constitution. I mean, people rely a lot on radio stations. Going also into local government elections in 2021, community radio has played a huge part, you know, because that's where leaders go and campaign, and that's where communities come and, you know, bring up the issues that they want to take to council. So it's a bit unfortunate on my part.
I mean, one of the things you raised was the issue of capacity, technical capacity. And I mean, I started at Rhodes Music Radio. And at some point, I was programming manager, I did afternoon drive, I read the news, I was a music librarian and studying. You know, so there is this idea. And the reason for that, the reason why people do so many things is because community radio stations simply cannot afford to pay people. So you end up with volunteers, even people who are permanent doing more than one thing. But again, it comes back to this big old question about, yes, we say community radio is very important, and it is. That's why we've licensed as many as we've had, both campus, you know, community radio, you know, even in small places like Etala in the Eastern Cape have their own community radio stations, at Ofimvaba. But we really haven't thought about a sustainability model for these community radio stations. So if they cannot afford to pay people, they cannot generate income in the way that the big commercial entities are going to, then, you know, how are they going to pay royalties, be on top of the admin, etc., etc.? There is this big question about what have we done to ensure the sustainability of the community radio sector?
And this is a very good question, actually, Vanessa Skooks. And I think one of the problems is funding. Definitely one of the problems is funding. And, you know, I recently read that the government also falls short on its, you know, prerogative to say that it will spend 30% of its ad spend on community radio stations, which for me would have done so much more in terms of being able to get people who are perhaps capacitated to do administrative work within these community radio stations. But as you say, I also don't think that there is a sustainable plan, you know, that to keep radio stations, community radio stations running. But also, I also have a reservation around even this concept of community radio stations, because for me, what does it mean to have, you know, a particular mainstream radio station and to have others that we label and we think lowly of as community radio stations? And this is precisely why it's easy to close 40 of them. It will never happen to mainstream media where you can close even up to 10 at one go. But I guess it's an increasing trend in the country that we're seeing, you know, the shutdown of media houses, whether mainstream or community. And it's a worrying factor for media freedom activists like myself. And we shouldn't use the fact of, you know, community radio stations not having particular plans. I mean, the public broadcast, the SABC itself, we've seen recently how they've been plagued by problems, but the government quickly comes in and gives them bailout. Perhaps not quickly, but it does come in and gives them bailouts, rightfully so. But we are not seeing that same rigor, that same zeal for community radio stations. And for me, that is worrying. Even though the bigger question of why do we have, in one South Africa, we have sort of like two industries. We have community radio stations and we have mainstream. Who is the mainstream and who is in the periphery? And why are they not brought into the mainstream? But that's also another conversation for another day, I guess.
I mean, there's been many criticisms of ICASA as a regulator for a variety of reasons in terms of, you know, spectrum, in terms of just capacity to be a present and able regulator for. We've got quite a large, robust media space, from commercial to community, etc. Is that still an issue, the issue of capacity at ICASA? Because it had been one of the challenges for many years.
Okay, I'd be dishonest if I say I knew, you know, the inner workings of ICASA, but I'm very much aware of the criticisms that have been, you know, leveled against the regulator. And I, for one, also agree necessarily with that there is perhaps a problem of capacity within ICASA to deal with this problem of, you know, so many radio stations, so many people wanting to get licenses to receive spectrums so that they can have their own radio stations. So I think there is generally a question of capacity within the regulator, as with most regulators in our country, unfortunately.
I mean, what happens, for instance, we know that community radio campus stations are also great training grounds for people. It's one of the few places where you're allowed to experiment, we're allowed to do a variety of things. So, for instance, if you look at, you know, UCT radio, if they're closing down, what then happens to the opportunity for students in around Cape Town to get involved in radio in a way they wouldn't otherwise access? Because you can't really access the big commercial so-called mainstream entities. But there's also that reality that, in addition to fulfilling quite a big democratic role, it also serves as quite an important training ground.
Yes, definitely. So for those who are perhaps media students or who have interest in media, it does provide, you know, a very much good training ground. I myself also come from varsity newspaper, so I've went through the drama, and I've had friends who also went to varsity radio station. So it's really important, and then it's worrying then if they're not getting this sort of practical knowledge at varsity level, and then coming into sort of like mainstream media where they missed an opportunity because there's a closure of community radio stations. But beyond that, I mean, these campus radio stations also played a big role in terms of democratizing the space of universities, particularly during the Fallist era. You know, these radio stations were where students, because they couldn't access mainstream media outside of campus, this is where the messages were spread around what student grievances were, student problems, and so forth and so on. So, yeah.
It's tough.
It's very tough.
It's very tough.
It's very difficult.
Azola, I must thank you very much for your time this morning. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Azola joins us from Media Monitoring Africa, where he is a researcher responding to at least 40 community radio stations that are going to be taken off air due to licensing issues.